So, okay, guys, I'm greeting everybody. I don't know all the languages because as we are doing a game also in the other session, we have many countries together here at this session. So we have Italy, we have UK, we have US, only, let's say, in the panel, but also we have lots of countries already in the participant list. That is increasing, but we are starting. So welcome to this session on the LPPD track. I am Monica Rossi, professor at the University Politecnico di Milano in Milan, Italy. And together with me, Darren Walsh, that is a consultant for the Lean Enterprise Academy from UK. And we had a very nice presentation later, earlier, with him. And our speaker for today would be John Drogots. He is a product and process development coach at the Lean Enterprise Institute with about over 25 years of experience on thinking and applying lean manufacturing product development behind the shop floor experience. He worked with the main, let's say, player in the field of lean manufacturing and product development, as well as Liker and John Shook. And he is also a teacher on lean product and process development and lean manufacturing for the College of Engineering in the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where probably is based more or less right now. I don't know if you are there. In that case, probably also have snow outside. In Italy, it's quite cold, but not snowy yet. And welcome you guys, everybody from the different part of the world, the different season. That's great that we have the possibility to be here together from so far away, to be so close to listen to John Drogos presenting now. So thank you. Welcome, everybody. I will be asking John to share his screen, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Monica. And I didn't want to mention, but I'm actually in Florida now, so it's nice and warm for me, not to be mean to
That's why you
everybody
didn't
else.
want to mention. Yeah, yeah. So let's
All
go
right. Welcome,
let's go back
everyone.
to Lean.
So welcome, everyone, to our session. So today's topic is an interesting one. As lean product and process development continues to evolve, we certainly see that this integration of hardware and software has become a much more interesting topic for many of the organizations for which I work with, and just in the lean community, a lot of questions come my way. So I thought today I would share a little bit, some background and context around hardware and software development integration, talk a little bit about the challenge, some from the past, and really what are we seeing today and what are we trying to address. And then maybe provide you a few thought starters on some LPPD principles and practices to maybe help for those of you who are finding yourself in that type of situation. And then we'll do a bit of a conclusion and some Q&A, questions and answers at the end. So that's kind of where we're headed for today. So I always like to start with purpose. And in product and process development, we're ahead of actually the delivery stream. So our first and foremost mission is to create new customer value. And that's really spending that time to optimize the overall product or system to get that total value. And in many ways, that's what's driving the top line growth in most of your organizations. But the other part of our mission is also to design the future value streams to deliver that value throughout the product's life cycle. Because a lot of the design work is really driving the cost and just the efficiency and effectiveness of those future value streams, and sets up that quality potential. And the idea is to try and design out the waste versus using Kaizen later to drive them out. So in particular, when we talk about product development, that's been changing in most industries. Many products now provide value through a combination of physical product characteristics and also software features to enhance the customer's experience. In some cases, they're kind of the foremost element for some products. The other thing is software features and enhancements for the voice of business is also becoming a future revenue source. So how we think about our product throughout its life cycle It's more than just selling it the first time. It's actually thinking about how we can continue to enhance it throughout its life cycle. And in many industries, software is one of those elements. So that's a great opportunity for organizations. It's a great option for customers to get more value out of the products that they buy. But it does, as everything else, introduce some new challenges. And I think in most cases, traditional product development systems have frankly been designed through a hardware lens for the most part. Software and hardware development have traditionally been more decoupled activities. Clearly that's been changing, but as that's changing, we've also seen that there's kind of been, over the last decade to 2 decades, kind of parallel tracks of how the development processes have evolved. So software development has moved from traditional waterfall to a more agile development mindset to drive flow and speed. Hardware development has also been moving away, for the most part, from waterfall, using various methods to kind of drive flow and speed as well. And how do we kind of bring those two together in order to provide that value? Because in most cases, that traditional product and process development, that waterfall view of trying to add value and passing it along, also typically leads to late discovery and a lot of rework and churn. And I think we've seen for many organizations that is one of the key incubators of waste when we have this more waterfall style. Longer cycles also ensue, which doesn't make our customers very happy as well. So with lean product and process development, trying to drive flow and eliminate waste is really trying to get more towards a continuous and concurrent flow to really get that true reduction of time to market, not just forcing it with more people and more resources and more effort. But that requires a lot more early, frequent collaboration and a lot of fast feedback loops. And quite frankly, both the hardware and software communities are both trying to shoot for that image that we see here. Easier said than done. So, the goal though is more than just speed. It really needs to start, as we said with my first slide, the premise of maximizing the total value to the customer. If we're fast with the wrong product, who cares? If we're fast with a subpar product, again, the customer may accept it, but they may not come back again. So we need to get that value as well as speed. That's kind of the major goal that we have. And as I mentioned, I kind of wanted to step back a little bit and provide some context before we get into solutions. So, some of you may be from the software world, some of you may be from the hardware world that are part of this presentation. So I kind of wanted to level set us a little bit in this early stage. So for those who aren't so familiar, the software development community has kind of embraced, for the most part, Agile. And the context there really goes back to the late 1990s, early 2000s. And they called it their manifesto, if you will, the Agile manifesto. And the problem they were trying to solve back then was, there was an explosion of personal computing, the internet's coming online, and across the wider industry, there was a feeling that the status quo just wasn't working anymore. And the lag time between business needs and getting it in the hands of their customers was roughly 3 years at that time. And standard processes were unwieldy. A lot of people were overburdened with documentation oversight. I would argue the product hardware side wasn't much different. And I would say to varying degrees, everyone's still struggling to this same kind of constant problem. But in the Agile world, they actually started thinking about this. And the mindset, when we talk with a lot of the software engineers, they kind of think this way in their principles. And the reason why I bring this up is, while that word Agile has been around, and sometimes we hear lean and Agile, they're actually very complementary. In fact, if we look at the time Agile came out around 2001, the first evolution of it was right around the time when lean was really starting to take hold. And we see similar types of, I'll say, principles that evolved in the software track as what we talk about in our lean world, just maybe different terminology. Satisfying the customer through early continuous delivery, working frequently, small increments of work, sound familiar? Working together as teams, motivated individuals, giving them the environment and support they need and trust them to get the job done, face-to-face collaboration, technical excellence, simplicity, reflecting on how to become more effective. A lot of these elements are also in the lean constructs that we talk about in our lean community as well. So while the terms may be different, the software teams actually over the years have come to similar conclusions. And as you can well imagine, just as the word lean has various meanings in different organizations, that word agile is also a fairly large umbrella. And as I looked and did a little bit of research, there's been over the last decade and a half different versions of agile and approaches that all fall under that umbrella. So everything from Scrum, you also see some lean words in there. Kanban, that word is sometimes used within agile teams, lean software development, extreme programming. Also, development ops is another term that's out there as well. There are different terminologies. And the reason why I bring this up is that's the same thing when the software folks are looking towards words like lean and Six Sigma. They also have that same question of trying to understand that framework. So just trying to get that sense of what it's all about and having the different hardware and software teams trying to understand and speaking the same language. As I'm speaking English here, many of you, your native language is in English. So hopefully, as we translate, that doesn't always, it's some innuendos are not always very clear. And it's the same thing here when hardware and software teams work together. So understanding our context, I think, is very important. And for the most part, though, for those who aren't familiar with Agile, the Scrum methodology is probably the most known piece. So you hear a lot, and the product teams say, well, what do they mean by Scrum? What are they talking about? And the Agile teams are really focused on very small increments of development. So very much like this idea in lean of one-piece flow, very much towards that same spirit. The translation, though, is a little bit different in the software environment. Now, first of all, understanding what value is, that's the product owner, and they have a different feature list that's there. Then they do their planning, and then the team gets together, and usually team members are on one Scrum team. So just like a work cell that we talk about in lean, very similar. And then they will usually work to a 1 to 4 week sprint, and usually some development and testing as well. And the done solution is some kind of working code at the end of the day. That's kind of the goal. And the teams are, of course, in that 1 to 4 weeks are not just working in isolation. They have daily stand-ups, they have some reviews, and at the end, they have a retrospective. So teams are trying to develop in the software world small increments of workable code that is hopefully saleable to the customer. So they're working at a very steady, kind of say cadence as they're going through that process. And quite frankly, in the software world, Agile works quite well when we have dedicated team members. The product owner can really represent that end customer and clearly articulate the requirements. The scope of work can be well defined, and the work can be broken, and frankly, into small, discrete, independent increments that can be executed in their entirety. And frankly, we can change the sequence as desired based on the customer needs. So one of the appealing parts of Agile is that flexibility. However, there are also some assumptions, and one major assumption is there are no or minor dependencies with other parts of the product design. So there's software in many cases, not all cases, has a very standard type of architecture, and the interfaces tend to be a little more fixed. So the trade-offs are usually clear, or in some cases, there really are very few trade-offs to be had that can't be dealt with within the team itself. So in those environments, the teams can run fairly autonomously and execute and gradually keep building, if we want to use the Lego term, Lego blocks until finally they build the image or the finished software product. Now, as I mentioned, I'm giving you one snapshot. Agile, just like product development and Lean, is continually evolving. So I always say when you're working with your software teams, ask them their terminology. I just went online and picked a few examples that I saw. And you can see here the methodologies are similar, but the terminologies are different. So as you're working with your teams, there are different flavors of how Agile is implemented. And that's not a bad thing. Teams should, just like we talk about, Lean is situational, so is Agile software development, and it needs to fit the organization in which it's working. However, when you're working in that organization, we need to understand how the other team is working. So I share that with you because those who are in the product development side of the house who are making physical product, sometimes that software piece seems very nebulous. And likewise, my software teams, when they look at hardware, they go, I see you folks working in these stage gates for the most part. I see you folks using this V model of development, which kind of makes sense to us, but how do we plug in? We see that you folks are using your CAD models. We see you folks doing product and process simulation. You're doing rapid prototyping. So there's a lot of things we're seeing for you to accelerate. We also see that you have improvement activities. Some of you are calling it Design for Six Sigma. Others are calling it Lean product development. So the software teams also struggle to try and understand the terminology as they're working. So as we start looking at the challenge going forward, as software and hardware teams are less and less decoupled and frankly need to be connected together, there's a lot of outside as well as inside factors that start coming into play that require more collaboration than ever before. The obvious is the customer expectations continue to grow, but they're looking for solutions to problems, not just something that meets requirements or workable code, as the initial intent of software and Agile was, and also in product teams, frankly. And the other thing is speed continues to be a problem, or a challenge, I should say. It's not a problem. Customers want it today. That's an expectation. But the big part that is probably clearer and clearer is that trade-offs are anything but clear. And a lot of those trade-offs go across components, subsystem, and yes, software. So working in isolated pockets is becoming less possible. It's truly a more challenging environment. So cost versus quality, performance, value stream delivery, sustainability. Also, we don't have fixed lead times. Some products can't work in a cadenced manner that is more fixed and can't break the problem down. The supply of components and tooling, as we know in today's world, is certainly a challenge, but even just co-developing, some of that development's happening outside. It's not a team that's within the organization. And the term cross-functional becomes broader and broader. And many times team members are not dedicated. They're working on multiple products at the same time, and in more and more cases, in multiple locations. So that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in. So the question is, what are maybe some potential solutions to talk about that might help us? And I think when we talk about LPPD, before we get into the practices, just like I mentioned, Agile had some principles. We kind of step back, and in LPPD, some of the guiding principles line up quite well. People first. I mean, at the end of the day, it's where the ideas come from, understanding and executing, synchronizing our workflows, which is a big topic of today's conversation, but also building and learning as we go. It's not just executing. It's clearly a team sport, as I just mentioned. And we also have to think about the product lifecycle. How do we design the overall value stream as we're designing the product and the services? So, lean development process really starts with first understanding and then executing with speed and precision and capturing learnings as we go. And by the way, we get better the more we practice. So continuous development, similar to the Agile construct. So when we talk about the phases of product development, I'm sure each one of you have your own phases. They're all different. But arguably, we could say that there is a study phase and there's an execution phase. If you break down whatever way you folks have your development system. And that study phase is really around understanding how the product creates unique value and identifying and closing those knowledge gaps. So before we just start developing, we need to make sure we've closed those gaps and understand that value. And as we're going through that, we're also aligning and enrolling the team in the organization. And that puts us in a better place to create a plan to truly deliver and execute with speed. And that understand, then execute is really key. We see a lot of organizations, product, hardware, and software, that sometimes just jump right into the solution before really understanding the problem and the value. And in our minds, there are a lot of things in the front end that we can be doing. Some practices that are helpful are the concept paper, decision flows to identify the key questions we need to answer and identify those knowledge gaps, rapid learning cycles to close those gaps. And in many cases, the first solution is not usually our best one. So how do we do more structured exploration? Things such as set-based concurrent engineering. For today's conversation, I really wanted to key in on that first one around understanding value, because I think that one really is at the crux of putting the pieces together for us as we're going through that phase of development. That concept paper is really the product of the study phase. It's not a one and done. It actually evolves as we're going through, and it synthesizes everything into a compelling vision. That's really important because, as we look, there are a lot of dependencies, and we need to understand those trade-offs and start understanding how we're going to build that product up and build its value stream along with it. And we can't write it chapter by chapter as we go. That's something that organizations have seen. My wife is an author, and she's an English professor, and she always says you can't write a story without having some outline, and you need to have that outline. You can't just write it as you go. And I think that's the same thing for us. That concept paper there is helping us align the entire team so that we have that common goal. So we have the customer needs and the internal constraints. And that takes time to get that alignment. But if we don't have that, it's very challenging to move forward. But once we do, then we can start executing with speed and precision. So it isn't speed at any cost. We need to make sure that we get the precision as well. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, is some solutions in this particular phase, because most people will be working is really in this execution phase. And as we start talking about these elements, one of the key elements is really around synchronizing workflow. So some of the techniques to help us do that, the Agile methods are certainly one of them. Others that I wanted to talk about is really around trying to visualize and synchronize the workflows. And this idea of really understanding compatibility before completion. And a lot of that is really around understanding the different, I'll say, connection points and dependencies. So we'll talk a little bit about critical events, some readiness levels, and using design reviews to embed learning as we go through. But all of these require good transparency and cadence collaboration in order for them to work very well. And in order to do that, I think the first part is understanding the work together. So I mentioned before, I think sometimes hardware and software teams speak different languages. How do we make that visual so we make sure we're all speaking the same language? Product, and the room kind of evolves as the product evolves. But the first part is making sure we have clear goals, and from the concept paper, is that very visual to the team? And do we really understand the customer very well? So those who are more in the software world, the user-centered design, using that terminology is something that's fairly prevalent. So again, do we really understand what it is we're trying to achieve? And do we really understand the customer? And is that front and center in our Obeya? I see a lot of places who track measures, but are we really focused on that value creation front and center? But then The challenge is, how do we create that value at the end of the day and deliver it? And I think part of the problem is I see design teams, hardware teams, software teams working actually too hard, I think, in most cases. They're rowing really hard. They're sprinting, they're scrumming, they're developing, they're doing whatever word you want to use. But I think the real challenge is trying to get it organized to be more like that lower boat, because that boat, the rowers are going to row a lot smoother with less effort and frankly get to their destination much more efficiently and effectively. So to make that happen, how do we plan the work? That's really the question. Because if we're going to work together, that's how we want to start getting the team to understand their terminology and understand how the pieces fit together to make that product work. So here's an example of doing that. So this is an example actually of a team that had hardware as well as software. So some teams were actually using Agile methods. I kind of put those little black loops to kind of show this, the sprints that were going on. However, as you can see here, there were also some arrows that I kind of highlighted, a little hard to see from the picture, but there were certain dependencies. So one of the things that's really important for the software teams is to know the sequence. We don't want them to sprint and then have to resprint the same activity because things change. And one of the ways to help clarify that is to use clear milestones to kind of sequence and pull tasks in the right sequence, and really understanding those key dependencies as a team. So the more the team understands each other's work, the more they can flesh out those dependencies and make sure that they're having the collaboration at the right time. And as we start thinking about that, this really leads to one of the fundamental terms. We can't wait for everything to be done before the next person starts working. It's very different than in a manufacturing environment where I finish the part and I move it to the next station. This idea of compatibility before completion is one of the foundational elements for speed, but also creating successful value streams. And it's really maximizing the use of incomplete but stable data. How can I start working on the pieces that may, yes, be incomplete, but stable so that I can actually do my work or do my sprint? And no matter how well I plan it, things are going to change. Product development is anything but a certain sport. And as a result of that, we're going to need to manage the work, and we're going to have to manage it together. And product development is a team sport, and it's certainly a contact sport. So I kind of like the Agile teams calling it a Scrum. It really is. We do need to take the field, and we do need to work together. So as we think about managing the work together, do we have a very good visual management system in place to make that happen? And some teams need to meet more frequently than others. So in the Agile world, they very much like the daily. And for actual activities, even hardware teams, for daily work, that's kind of helpful. Other things, we need to maybe meet weekly. And for more strategic things, monthly suffices. So we also need to think about the right cadence for the different things we're doing on a particular project. So as we look at this particular team carrying through my example, they had daily stand-ups for each subsystem, and then they had weekly cross-functional stand-ups. And that system was there to see normal from abnormal. And as you can see, very simple standards, tasks in yellow, milestones or critical events in blue, and risks in red. That really helped the team, first of all, be able to see the problems, effectively communicate them, more importantly, respond in a timely manner, and hopefully provide helpful help. It's one thing to make it red, it's a very different thing to solve that problem. And that's really what we're trying to do, is bring teams together to solve those problems as we go through. And I've shown you physical examples, but actually that same product team, even pre-COVID, they were spread out across the globe. So part of this was actually done electronically, so that the system, if you will, was actually managed in a virtual environment. So it can be done in a virtual environment. But the local teams still did their visual management locally. And actually, this is a product hardware team, and they actually embraced several of the Scrum principles, as you can see here. Daily stand-ups, what needs to be done, gaps, and so forth. So the teams were actually aligning their scrums to that higher level schedule. And then as they had problems, they were able to escalate them as needed every week. In some cases, they even met twice a week as things got a little heavier to get done. But that was kind of how they approached things. The other thing that team, because they were distributed, didn't do, but I highly recommend, is it's also important for us to see how the product, not just the project, is evolving. So metrics and timelines are fantastic, but at the end of the day, the customer doesn't buy a timeline, and they sure don't buy a glide path. They buy a product. So whether it's the software, whether it's the hardware, every time we get together, can we see how the product is evolving? So we're all seeing really what's happening as much as we can real time. So that's an important aspect as a sanity check against just data. But milestones, as I mentioned, is probably one of the ways to really get teams aligned. And milestones is a term that, as we're starting to look in our LPPD community, we're starting to transition to some words like critical events to distinguish, because milestones or critical events are not just activity based. I did a build or I didn't. They need to be really focused on key integration points as we're going through, not just critical path items. It's really where the pieces come together and we see whether we're aligned. There needs to be a clear and aligned purpose and a clear quality event criteria to tell us whether we did well or didn't do well. Because the point is here, much as we're working our separate pieces and we're sprinting or we're doing whatever we're doing, every so often, no matter how hard we plan it, we need to make sure we're still coming together. And these are opportunities for us to detect normal from abnormal conditions. So this is just an example of a company who actually had those critical events laid out. So for each project, they could diagnose where they happened on a timeline was different for each project, but they were able to, at these points, diagnose how we were doing as a team. And that really helped the team see if we're doing well in these, our probability of doing well on the program is going to be very well as well. Doesn't guarantee. Other teams have also seen that this is a helpful way. How do we know we're on track to a plan? So we can look at the schedule, but as work gets done, the product is maturing differently. So in a factory, we will see this in many lean factories. If you walk in, you can see that at a workstation, we can see where the operator is relative to the cycle. For us in development, it's a little harder. So some teams look at operational readiness levels. So many companies I've worked with have found this to be a helpful way to do it. So the milestones help plan the work, but then we also periodically want to demonstrably score objectively how we're doing on the project. So if the milestones aren't so much of interest, some organizations have certain points in time where they bring the entire value stream team together, and they do, I would argue, it's kind of a detailed design review to look at those readiness levels. And those readiness levels, in this example, you can see this one is for manufacturing, but some do it for commercial, some do it for technical. And you can see here that at each stage, in the early stages, the readiness level is going to be very low for manufacturing in this example. And you can see it's not linear. And that, I think, is really key, because as we're going through projects, cost, quality, manufacturing readiness, they are not evolving linearly, but where should they be at any given point in time? So these are certain checkpoints for the team to step back from their daily work and really assess as a team, are we on our glide path towards that delivery? Because most of you, I'm guessing, aren't delivering products in 4 or 5 weeks. It's a long marathon to get to the finish line for your end product. So we want to have a diagnosis to see if we're on track, not just today, but are we looking good for the next several weeks or months in our development cycle? And the last piece, and it's one of the areas that's near and dear to my heart, is I think design reviews are one of the areas where teams really need to go deeper. We're starting to see that teams, everyone does design reviews, but are we getting as much as we can out of them? It's really the place where we can surface technical issues much earlier, and it's a great place to develop our products as well as our people. This is a forum where teams can get into the detail, where we can have the rigorous, candid, and frankly, at times difficult conversations and really practice the scientific method. We talk about PDCA, but this is really the area where we want to plan and do adjust. And as teams work through it, we again want to see the product or the software, whatever it is we're reviewing, as you can see. But this is also a place to capture the knowledge as we go and to solve problems. So our friend the A3 is also a very helpful tool as an input and an output to this process. So for teams who are working on design reviews, product engineers are used to having these for the most part, but their system level and their subsystem, think about involving your software teams. I don't see software teams get involved in these because they're sometimes not invited, and they may not be directly involved in every design review, but there's certain parts where they can really add some thought to that process. So as we think about these elements, making it visual, being able to look at that visual schedule, aligning our work between ourselves, sequencing the work, then managing that work through the Obeya, through those milestones or critical events, through the various parts. We start really getting people into different forums, which ultimately all of those are around trying to solve problems. And the more we bring our teams together, the product value stream and the people value stream get connected through problem solving. So as we develop the product, we develop stronger problem solvers. Some of the techniques I'm showing you there are nothing more than that, but they're cross-functional problem solving for hardware as well as software teams as they go through this process. So as we think about these practices, how do we visualize and synchronize our workflows? The visual schedule and having those discussions with the team in Obeya can be very helpful. Ideas around compatibility before completion. I kind of showed you 3 different ways of approaching that. The critical events to create the pull, the readiness levels to see if we're on track, and the design reviews to kind of make sure we're compatible, but also to embed the learning and capture the learning. But as we go through that, transparency and collaboration is key as we're going through. And I think the key part of all of this is keep in mind the synchronizing workflows and our guiding principles. Beware of the terminology. It's more important that, whether we use agile terms, lean terms, is the team organized? Do they understand before they're executing? Do they have the common goal of what the value add is? Are they working as a team continuously and synchronizing the workflows to really deliver that value to their customer as they go through this particular process? So with that said, I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much, John. So yeah, indeed we have questions. So I will start from the first one from Ricardo. What is the characteristics that LPPD can absorb from Agile, and what could Agile take advantage of LPPD approach?
Well, as we look, I think actually both are using those same principles. They're just using different terminology. So I think one thing that Agile contributed very well was trying to take this idea of small lot, one piece flow, and really trying to drive that conversation down into smaller increments of work. I think that was something our product engineers may not be able to reach quite the same level, depending on your products. But I think it's a great contribution to this idea of continuous flow. I think that probably is one of the things teams should stretch themselves. I hear a lot of product teams say, or hardware teams say, well, that's software. Well, the software teams took a lot of time to try and figure that out as they're going through. So I think that's really one of the key parts. I think conversely, where the Agile teams have started hitting the wall and I shouldn't say hitting the wall. I should say that they solved the problem they set out to solve, which was how to get better flow. But now it's how to create more value. And software by itself isn't able to just create elements unless the product is just software. But as they're integrating with hardware, these dependencies become all the more real. And having them understand the flow and those interdependencies and being part of the discussion at trade-offs. There's a lot of things that hard teams are struggling with and vice versa. And I think bringing them together in the Obeya construct, these critical events or readiness level reviews, whichever methodology you use, integration points are really good elements to bring the teams out of their smaller scrums and into the bigger view of the world and seeing how the work fits together so they can really add as much value as possible.
Okay, so another question I think would be very linked to what you said, because it's about, again, how does Scrum Agile tie in with Lean? Is there a trade-off? How can organization adopt LPPD? So again, about Agile and Lean.
Well, I think one of the things we always want to stay away from as much as we can is the dogma. So I've seen this, well, this is Agile, this is Lean. I think with the teams is really how do we make sure we understand how we're going to develop the product, and can we see the whole value stream, and how is the team connected as we're going through. So as you saw in my example there, some teams found that the Agile methods in their subsystems were a great way to work and collaborate, and it worked fine for them. Other teams did not find that to work so well because the problem was different, and that's okay. But we want to make sure that if we're working different ways for different reasons, we're still integrating towards the end goal, which is delivering that highest value to the customer in the shortest lead time. And that's really where I think the integration elements of LPPD can come into play.
Thank you. When we define a lead time for a new product, in this case, are we only considering the software portion of product development?
I think we need to look at both, but that is becoming a harder definition. That's a great question, by the way, because software teams are releasing updates more frequently in many product environments that I'm dealing with. So when we talk about that, the product has, I'm not going to the store every week, but I can drop something in my iPhone app every week. So how you're measuring lead time, I think, is really an interesting conversation. I think there is the initial delivery, but then there is also kind of the follow-on delivery if you're having those add-ons that I was mentioning in my first presentation. So it's really, I think, from identifying a customer need to delivering that customer need. And that customer need may be different throughout the life cycle, as we're seeing in some products. I buy the product and then I buy add-ons later, or I have product refreshes or updates or new features that are flashed into the product that I purchase. So for some of you, how you're measuring that lead time, I always say start from that customer need to when it gets in their hand, whether it's hardware, software, or a combination.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we have a feedback. The main problem, John, is that they work as a group, not as a team. So we have a problem when, there is a group working together and not a team. We need to develop back the teamwork instead of a group work, where there is no mutual collaboration. So there was just a feedback on what you...
Yes, that's absolutely true. It's a team sport. That's one of our LPPD principles, and it's a contact sport.
Yeah, indeed.
Exactly.
And another feedback, this is why it's so important wireframe and prototype tools, to not only have a project view, but a product view too. Great. So there was a feedback on when you mentioned, in the Obeya view, we visualize not just a project, but the product. We have other
sometimes
questions.
Easier said than done, but
yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, sure.
Whenever you can, that helps teams very, very much so.
And that's great. And I'll keep going because we have other points. Again, in transitioning products from concept to pilot to high volume, there are cases where the developed software features are not set up to work effectively to high volume manufacturing. For example, auto-driving system installation in an automobile. How can final manufacturing lead times be incorporated in development of softwares that go into making the product?
Yeah, I'm working on a project right now where we're facing that, to be quite candid, and it's very, very challenging to really get those pieces. And this is where we really run into a fundamental part. Remember, I talked about executing with speed and precision. There's the speed part, but that precision part to make it line up is really key, because some of the things have to be done very, very well before it leaves the factory, and other things we can flash and we can send updates afterwards. And really understanding the differences between those elements of what needs to be done versus done, as I like to say, is one of the challenges as we're going through. I wish I had the perfect answer. Here's what you should do here, here, and here. But that's part of really managing the flow. And I think some of those readiness levels that I mentioned, I'm seeing teams, they need to stretch harder to really bring up at those different points what needs to be ready as we go through it, because we can't all just make it work at the last minute. That I think is one of the ways to help do that. And each one of your products is going to be a little different in terms of how you quote define ready and how many levels you should have. But that would be my advice as a starting point to work on that. At least that's what I'm trying right now with this customer that I'm working with. We'll see how it works.
You will let us know in the future.
That's what I was going to say. Maybe the next one I'll have an update for you on that one.
The next one we will
Stay
have an
tuned.
update for that. Yes. John, many Agile and Scrum teams struggle with effective leadership support. Do you have a view on how leadership helps?
Well, I think that's a problem not just in Agile teams. I think that's just an overall product development challenge. Leaders, as they get pressure from the C-suite to really try and, again, put a lot of pressure in terms of reducing time to market, because that obviously affects the top line growth of the business. And I think in a lot of organizations, I've seen this, I've heard Agile teams tell me this, we're doing Agile, but we're doing Agile light. And I would say the same with Lean, quite frankly. We're trying to eliminate waste. We're trying to get better flow. But a lot of the leadership is still working in the older mindset. It's like, we need this. You folks can go faster because you're leaner or you're more agile. So now we're cutting your lead time. Go figure it out. Instead of really providing the tools and the systems to enable the teams. As you saw in the Agile principles and in the Lean principles, people first. How do we really create the environment so that people can be successful? And I think that's where leadership's role is different. It's less directive and a lot more around the coaching and support. And that's whether we're talking Lean or whether we're talking Agile.
Okay, so I will try to finalize the question, but they still keeping arriving. Okay, one is about, it seems the hardware side and the software side work in silo. Why aren't there cross-functional teams organized around system components with software plus hardware dimension?
I'm seeing that actually that's part of the construct that we're trying to drive, I think, with this conversation, is the definition of team has to change. Because I do agree that historically those have been more decoupled than they should be. And I'm starting to see that some teams are seeing that, but frankly, there's a lot more work to be done. There should be, wherever there is that interaction, there should be software in your subsystem teams. It shouldn't just be its own thing. I completely agree with that. Otherwise, they don't have a seat at the table. And I feel for the software teams, a lot of times the hardware teams run ahead and then they say, well, software at the end, you go ahead and flash it and get it done. And the poor software teams are trying to catch up. So I think they need to be along for the ride all the way through and should be part of those core teams. Absolutely.
Indeed, we have another comment linked to this that says, I see many situations where there are 3 streams of activities: software development, hardware development, and then work using the hardware and the software together to develop calibration to make the two work together. All have their own scheduled patterns of update events. Would you advocate any additional methods to those shared at as the number of concurrent and interdependent streams of activity grow?
Well, I think that not being sure what that third piece really is the integration is really the magic at the end of the day. And here's where the challenge is. Sometimes that is given to somebody to run or a group of integrators. The problem is, we talk about a chief engineer at Toyota. Well, chief engineer at Toyota understands the car. There are very few chief engineers or system integrators that understand the hardware and the software enough to be able to do that as a separate lane. They really need to collaborate with both and develop the right questions and create the right forums to be able to have that conversation. That's really, really hard to do as we're going through. And I think that's a skill set that a lot of organizations are going to have to develop over time. That's not how people go to school. Monica, as a professor, those who are in the software stream, computer science, are not the same ones as do mechanical engineering. Those are very different disciplines.
Not at all.
And how we teach them is very different. So I think that is certainly a track. And what we call integration is also a question. I sit on a panel in COSI, and that's something we've been talking about as well, is that system integration. That's a great question. It's something I think needs more research, quite frankly. I haven't cracked that, and I haven't seen every organization is trying to fix that problem. We'll see.
Yeah, thank you. Finally, someone is proposing to apply domain-based design and architectures where software and hardware get together per domain, and they are trying. They're asking if that's something that are you familiar with? Did you apply that, or eventually we can also see if this could be a topic for a next presentation in the future eventually.
I have seen different teams. I'd have to know, just like definitions, what domain means. I have certain teams that are working by subsystem that are kind of cross-functional that way and have broken the architecture that way. So if that's what we're talking about, I think that's the right track. Getting the teams then to work between themselves, because you also have cross domains. That's also a challenge as you go forward.
Thank you. And they keep suggesting domain-driven design to help architect the system, but I think we are covering now that part. Someone is asking for contact. So, John, if you don't mind to share your contact, or anyway, I think that they can, they would like to keep the conversation going in the future. So eventually we can, I shared already my contact. So eventually, guys, you can write me, get in contact with me. I don't know, John, if you are confident or not to share your.
Yeah, if you want to just put my email in there, Monica, in the chat, feel free to do so.
Totally. I will. I wanted to ask you.
No, that's fine. I'm also, as you can see, this is a domain where I'm still doing research and trying some experiments with different companies. So I'm very interested in hearing from the community if there are different examples, case studies. I would greatly appreciate it, or at least have the dialogue to advance this topic further. We're just scratching the surface, and it's certainly something that's going to continue to be an important aspect.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here today with us. Thank you for the great questions, and thank you, John, for your time and for this very exciting and inspiring session. And
thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great evening, night, day, lunch, dinner, whatever you're going to have. That's great that we are here from all over the world. That's exciting. And thank you again, John. Thank you, Darren. And
thank you, John.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Monica.
Bye.
Bye.